One summer night in the late 1970s, a young woman named Hannah was sitting next to her husband at a blackjack table inside of the Genting Highlands casino. This was a massive, sprawling resort complex nestled high up in the mountains of central Malaysia. The room they were in was incredibly bright, it was loud, and there were people packed in everywhere. There was thick cigarette smoke hovering in the air, people were drinking and chatting and laughing, and the sounds of gambling filled the entire space. As Hannah sat in this chaotic environment, she was doing her absolute best not to let her nerves get the better of her, but she just could not help it. She was feeling incredibly anxious because her husband had just done something very risky. He had bet every single one of their chips on this one single hand of blackjack. Her husband had been dealt his 2 starting cards, and when they added them up, they totaled 19. In the game of blackjack, this is an excellent position to be in. The goal is to get your cards to total as close to 21 as possible without going over. If you go over 21, you bust, which means you instantly lose. So, having a total of 19 is a very strong hand, but at the end of the day, you are playing directly against the dealer. It is a battle of who can get closer to 21. The dealer had his 2 cards on the table. One of them was facing up, and it was a 10. The other card was facing down. Hannah sat there holding her breath, anxiously waiting for that second card to be flipped over. She was desperately praying that it would not be another 10, because that would give the dealer a total of 20. Which would beat her husband's 19 and wipe out all of their money in an instant. Slowly, the dealer reached down and flipped over the face-down card. It was a 4. This meant the dealer currently had a total of 14. This was great news for Hannah and her husband because they were still in the lead. But in blackjack, the dealer has to keep taking more cards, which is called hitting, until their total reaches at least 17, or until they beat the player, or until they go over 21 and bust. So the dealer had to draw another card. He reached over to the deck, pulled a card, and placed it face up on the table. It was an 8. With that 8 added to the 14, the dealer's total was now 22. The dealer had gone over 21. He had busted. Hannah and her husband had officially won the hand. Hannah instantly turned to her husband, completely overjoyed. They had just gambled every single cent they had on this trip, and they had won. It was a massive victory. Hannah and her husband were very modest, hardworking people. They did not have a lot of disposable income, and they had spent months saving up their money just to be able to afford this trip up to the Genting Highlands. They had wanted to visit this luxury mountain resort for a very long time, and now that they were finally here, their luck was turning out to be absolutely incredible. They had been having an unbelievable run of good luck all evening, and with this final blackjack hand, they had just doubled their entire bankroll. This was the most money they had ever held in their hands at one time. They gathered up their large pile of plastic chips, said goodbye to the excited onlookers at the table, and walked over to the cashier's cage. They handed over the chips and received a thick stack of cash. Hannah was buzzing with excitement. She leaned in close to her husband and suggested that instead of making the long, exhausting drive back down the winding mountain road tonight, they should use some of their winnings to book a room at the luxury hotel right here at the resort. They could get a nice dinner, sleep in a comfortable bed, and maybe even come back to the casino tomorrow. She wanted to turn this successful night into a real vacation, but as she looked at her husband, she realized he did not seem interested in booking a room or going to a nice restaurant. He looked at the stack of cash in his hands, his eyes wide with excitement, and told her that he felt incredibly lucky. He believed he was on a roll and that his winning streak was far from over. He did not want to just pack up and go to sleep. He told Hannah that he wanted to take this money over to the high-limit slot machines and try to win even more. He was convinced that tonight was their night to become truly wealthy. Hannah looked at him like he had lost his mind. She reminded him that this was more money than they had ever won in their entire lives. It was a once-in-a-lifetime stroke of good luck, and if they stayed and kept gambling, they would inevitably end up giving all of it right back to the casino. She begged him to just take the win, walk over to the front desk, and book the hotel room so they could celebrate safely. But her husband was completely consumed by the thrill of the win. He ignored her pleas, turned around, and walked straight over to the row of flashing slot machines. Hannah felt her stomach drop, but she followed him anyway. She stood right beside him as he began feeding their hard-earned cash into the machine, one bill after another. Within the first few minutes, it became very clear that his luck had completely run out. He was losing hand after hand, spin after spin. Hannah kept pulling at his sleeve, begging him to stop and walk away while they still had a portion of their winnings left, but he was completely unresponsive. He was in a trance, convinced that the very next spin would be the big one that turned it all around. This painful cycle went on for 2 agonizing hours. Hannah watched in absolute silence as their pile of cash slowly dwindled down to nothing. Eventually, her husband stopped and checked his pockets. He had just a small handful of cash left. It was the exact amount of money they had originally set aside specifically to pay for a hotel room, just in case they stayed past midnight. Hannah felt a slight wave of relief. She told him that it was okay, that the winnings were gone, but they still had enough to get a room and sleep off the disappointment. She reached out her hand to take the remaining cash, hoping to finally end this nightmare of an evening. But just as they were about to walk away from the machine, her husband stopped. He looked at the slot machine, then looked at the cash in his hand and said he wanted to try just one more time. Before Hannah could even utter a word of protest, he shoved the last of their money into the slot, grabbed the metal lever, and pulled it down. The reels spun around and around, and then they clicked into place. It was a loss. They had officially lost every single dollar they had brought with them, along with every dollar they had won. They were now completely broke. They could not afford a hotel room, they had no money for food, and it was now the middle of the night. Their only option was to get into their car and make the long, treacherous drive back down the mountain road to their home. Hannah was absolutely furious. She walked out of the casino in silence, her arms crossed, refusing to even look at her husband. Her husband, on the other hand, was trying to make excuses, claiming it was just a sudden run of bad luck and that it was not entirely his fault. But Hannah was not buying it. She knew his greed had ruined what should have been an incredible, unforgettable night. About 20 minutes later, they were in their car, driving down the dark, winding mountain road. Hannah was sitting in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window, while her husband gripped the steering wheel in tense silence. It was the middle of the night, and the road was completely desolate. They had not passed a single other vehicle since they left the resort. The road they were on was surrounded on both sides by dense, ancient Malaysian jungle. Huge tropical trees and thick, tangled vines loomed over the asphalt, casting long, eerie shadows in their headlights. It was a notoriously quiet and spooky stretch of road, and the heavy silence inside the car only made the atmosphere feel even more oppressive. All Hannah wanted to do was get home, crawl into her bed, and try to forget that this night had ever happened. But as they were cruising along, the car suddenly began to shake. The engine started to sputter and make a coughing sound, and the vehicle began to lose speed. Hannah immediately turned her head and glared at her husband. Her husband looked back at her, his face pale with a mixture of embarrassment and dread. He knew exactly what was happening, and he knew he was about to face his wife's ultimate fury. He quietly admitted that he had noticed the gas gauge was running low earlier, but in his excitement to get to the casino, he had completely forgotten to stop and fill up the tank. A few seconds later, the engine gave one final gasp and died completely. The car rolled to a silent stop on the narrow shoulder of the road, right up against the edge of the thick jungle. Hannah sat there in the dark, her hands on her face, completely speechless. They were stranded in the absolute middle of nowhere, on a pitch-black mountain road, with no money, no working vehicle, and no way to call for help. It was the ultimate culmination of a disastrous night. Her husband knew he was entirely to blame for this situation. He had been the one who insisted on gambling away their hotel money, and he was the one who had neglected to put gas in the car. He looked at Hannah, trying to sound confident, and told her not to worry. He explained that he had an empty plastic gas can in the trunk of the car. He said he would take the can, walk down the road to the nearest gas station, buy a small amount of fuel, and bring it back to fill up the tank. He assured her that they could not be that far from a town and that he would be back before she knew it. He told her to stay inside the car, keep all the doors locked, and try to get some rest while he was gone. Hannah was too exhausted and angry to argue. She simply nodded and told him to just go and get the gas. She watched in the rearview mirror as her husband got out of the car, opened the trunk, and retrieved the red plastic gas can. Then, he walked past her passenger side window, giving her a quick wave before he disappeared into the heavy ink-black darkness ahead of the car. Once she was alone, Hannah immediately reached around and locked all 4 of the car doors. She rolled up the windows all the way to keep out the damp night air and the strange, loud sounds of the jungle insects. She reclined her seat back as far as it would go, closed her eyes, and tried to clear her mind. Despite her anger and the creepy surroundings, her physical exhaustion quickly took over and she fell into a light sleep, but her rest did not last long. Only about 10 minutes later, she suddenly snapped awake. There was no obvious reason for her to wake up, but she opened her eyes and felt a sudden wave of disorientation. For a few seconds, she could not remember where she was or why she was sleeping in the passenger seat of her car. But then, the harsh reality of the night came rushing back to her. She remembered the casino, the lost money, the empty gas tank, and the fact that her husband was currently walking down a dark mountain road by himself. She sighed, rolled over onto her side, and prepared to close her eyes again to wait out the rest of the time. Just as she was settling back into her seat, she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was a dull, heavy thud. It sounded like it had come from directly above her, on the roof of the car. Hannah sat up straight, her heart beating slightly faster. The car had no sunroof, so she could not look directly up to see what had caused the noise. The windows were fogged up from the humidity, and because there were no streetlights on this desolate road, she could not see anything through the glass but pure blackness. She tried to think logically. Her husband had only been gone for a little over 10 minutes. There was absolutely no way he could have walked to a gas station, filled up a can, and made it back to the car already. And even if he had somehow returned, why would he be up on the roof of the car instead of knocking on her window? She looked out the side window at the towering trees of the jungle. They were parked directly under several large overhanging branches. She reasoned that a sudden gust of wind must have caused a heavy branch to sway and strike the metal roof of the car. It was the only logical explanation. She let out a slow breath, telling herself that she was just being paranoid because of the dark environment. She leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes once more. A few seconds later, she heard it again. Thump. It was the exact same dull, heavy sound originating from the exact same spot on the roof. Hannah opened her eyes and stared up at the fabric ceiling of the car. She listened closely, waiting to see if it would happen again. Sure enough, after a brief pause, the sound returned. But this time, it did not stop. It became a slow, rhythmic, continuous thumping. Thump! 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 The sound was not incredibly loud, but in the absolute silence of the parked car, it was highly noticeable. It sounded exactly like something heavy and soft was repeatedly striking the metal roof. Hannah felt a growing sense of frustration. If this was a tree branch scraping against the car in the wind, it was going to make it absolutely impossible for her to get any sleep. She sat there, staring straight ahead through the windshield, listening to the relentless noise. She briefly considered opening her door, stepping outside, and checking the roof of the car to see if she could push the branch away. But as she looked out into the pitch-black jungle, a cold wave of dread washed over her. The atmosphere outside was incredibly menacing. She was a young woman completely alone in the middle of a dense tropical forest, miles away from civilization. She realized she was far too terrified to step out of the safety of the locked vehicle. She decided that the smartest and safest thing she could do was simply stay put and wait for her husband to return. She sat in the passenger seat, her eyes wide, staring at the empty road ahead of her. The thumping on the roof continued, steady and unbroken. Thump, thump, thump. A short while later, Hannah noticed a faint glow appearing on the horizon in front of her. Her heart leaped with excitement. The glow grew brighter and brighter, and she realized it was the headlights of an approaching vehicle. She sat up, watching as the lights cut through the thick darkness, illuminating the road ahead. She assumed that her husband had successfully reached a gas station, explained their situation to a kind stranger, and convinced them to drive him back to his stranded car. She prepared to unlock the doors and greet him. As the vehicle got closer, she could see that it was driving very slowly. It was clear that the driver had spotted their parked car on the shoulder and was preparing to stop. The headlights washed over Hannah's windshield, temporarily blinding her. She squinted through the light, waiting for the vehicle to pull up alongside them so she could see her husband's face. But then, something very strange happened. Just as the approaching vehicle got within a few yards of Hannah's car, the driver suddenly slammed on the gas. The tires screeched against the asphalt, and the vehicle swerved wildly around her car, accelerating down the road as fast as it could go. Within seconds, the red taillights of the vehicle vanished into the darkness behind her, and she was left in complete silence once again. Hannah sat there, completely stunned. She could not comprehend what had just happened. Why would a car slow down as if to help, only to suddenly panic and speed away at the last second? It made absolutely no sense. And the entire time this strange encounter was happening, the slow, rhythmic thumping on the roof of her car had never stopped. Thump, thump, thump. At this point, Hannah's annoyance turned into genuine, paralyzing fear. The realization began to sink in that her husband had been gone for a very long time. She did not know how far he had to walk, but she felt like he should have been back by now. The bizarre behavior of the passing car had deeply unsettled her, and the persistent thumping on the roof was starting to feel incredibly sinister. She could no longer convince herself that it was just a tree branch. A tree branch would not strike the roof with such perfect, unbroken rhythm for nearly an hour. Something else was on top of her car, or hovering right above it. She sat huddled in her seat, clutching her arms, staring out into the dark. Her mind began to spiral with terrifying scenarios. She wondered if her husband had been hurt, or if he had gotten lost in the jungle. She wondered if she was being watched by some wild animal, or worse, by a dangerous person hiding in the trees. She felt an intense urge to open the door and run down the road in the direction her husband had gone, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew that if she left the car, she would be completely vulnerable in the open darkness. She might miss her husband if he returned, or she might get lost in the dense jungle herself. She decided her only option was to remain inside the locked car and pray that someone would come to save her. Time seemed to slow down to an agonizing crawl. Every single second felt like an hour. The rhythmic thumping on the roof continued to echo through the quiet cabin of the car. Hannah kept her eyes glued to the road ahead, her breathing shallow and fast. She was on the verge of a complete panic attack when she suddenly saw another pair of lights appear in the distance. This time, as the lights got closer, she realized they were different from the previous car. There were bright, flashing blue and red lights mounted on top of the vehicle. It was a police car. Hannah felt a massive wave of relief wash over her. She almost burst into tears of gratitude. The police had finally arrived. She figured they must have been patrolling the mountain road, or perhaps her husband had managed to contact them from a gas station and send them to her rescue. She watched as the police cruiser slowly pulled up and came to a stop on the opposite side of the narrow road. Its headlights pointing directly toward her car, Hannah reached for her door handle, preparing to unlock it and run across the street to the safety of the officers. But before she could open the door, she stopped. The scene unfolding in front of her was not playing out the way she expected. The driver's side door of the police car opened, and an officer stepped out onto the asphalt. But instead of walking over to her to ask if she was okay, the officer immediately drew his service weapon from his holster. He raised the gun, using both hands to steady his aim, and pointed it directly at the roof of Hannah's car. His face was incredibly tense, and he was shouting something, though Hannah could not hear him through her closed windows. A second later, the passenger side door of the police cruiser opened, and another officer got out. He was holding a large megaphone. He brought it to his mouth, and his voice boomed across the quiet road, echoing off the trees of the jungle. He delivered 3 very specific, very urgent commands to Hannah. He told her to unlock her door and get out of the car immediately. He told her to walk directly over to the police cruiser without stopping. And finally, he commanded her, in a very serious tone, not to look back at her car under any circumstances. Hannah froze in her seat. She looked at the first officer, who was still standing with his gun drawn and aimed at her roof. She looked at the second officer, who was gesturing wildly for her to hurry. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The officer was not aiming his gun at her. He was aiming it at whatever was making that constant, rhythmic thumping noise on the roof of her car. She now knew with absolute certainty that there was something terrifying on top of her vehicle, and the police were deeply afraid of it. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her chest. She was absolutely terrified, but she knew she had to move. She reached down, unlocked her door, and pushed it open. The damp, cold night air rushed into the car, carrying with it the heavy smell of the jungle. As she stepped out onto the dark asphalt, she could still hear the thumping sound on the roof, louder now that the door was open. Thump. 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 She kept her eyes locked on the police officers across the street. She took a step forward, her legs shaking so violently she could barely stand. She remembered the officer's strict command, "Do not look back." She kept her head straight, refusing to turn around, and began to walk quickly across the road. Every single instinct in her body was screaming at her to run, to look behind her, to see what was chasing her, but she forced herself to keep moving forward. She reached the police cruiser, threw open the rear door, and scrambled into the back seat. The officer with the megaphone immediately slammed the door shut behind her, locking her inside. Hannah was finally safe inside the police car, protected by 2 armed officers. But now that the immediate danger of walking across the open road was over, her curiosity completely took over. The terror of the unknown was too much to bear. She had to know what had been on top of her car for the last hour. She turned her body around in the seat, pressed her face against the glass of the rear window, and looked back at her vehicle. What she saw was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The bright headlights of the police cruiser were shining directly onto her car, illuminating the entire roof. Standing on top of the vehicle was a person. It was a woman, but she did not look entirely human. Her clothes were filthy and torn, covered in dark mud and forest debris. Her skin was incredibly pale, almost gray, and her hair was extremely long, wild, and matted with dirt and leaves hanging down over her face. She was hunched over on all fours, her body twitching in a strange, unnatural way. As Hannah stared in horror, the woman on the roof began to make a chewing motion with her mouth. She seemed completely oblivious to the police presence, focused entirely on whatever she was holding in her hands. Slowly, the woman lifted her head. Her matted hair parted, revealing her face. Her eyes were wide, dark, and completely vacant, devoid of any human intelligence. Her mouth, her chin, and the front of her neck were completely covered in thick, dark, wet blood. And then, Hannah saw what the woman was eating. The woman was holding a human head. It was her husband's head, completely severed from his body. The slow, rhythmic thumping sound that Hannah had been listening to for the past 45 minutes had been the sound of her husband's blood dripping from his severed neck, pooling on the metal roof, and his hair repeatedly brushing against the car as the woman manipulated his head. Hannah let out a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream of pure agony and terror. At that exact moment, the police officer standing outside the cruiser opened fire. The quiet mountain air was shattered by the deafening sound of multiple gunshots. Sparks flew off the metal roof of Hannah's car as the bullets struck the vehicle. Hannah instinctively ducked down onto the floorboards of the police car, covering her ears and screaming as the gunfire continued to blast through the night. Through the chaos, she heard the sound of the gunshots suddenly stop. She heard the officer who had been firing shout to his partner. She heard the sound of heavy footsteps running across the asphalt toward her car. And then she heard a loud, heavy thud as something very heavy slammed onto the pavement of the road. A second later, there was the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling violently as something large and fast scrambled on all fours off the road and vanished deep into the thick, dark jungle. Then there was absolute silence. Hannah lay curled in a ball on the floor of the police car, sobbing uncontrollably. She was shaking so hard she could barely breathe. A few minutes later, she heard the heavy footsteps of the officers returning across the street. They opened the doors of the cruiser and got inside. Hannah could hear them breathing heavily, their voices shaking as they spoke to each other in hushed, panicked whispers. They were seasoned police officers, but it was clear that they had never witnessed anything like this in their entire lives. They could not even comprehend what they had just seen. One of the officers turned around in his seat and looked down at Hannah. His face was completely pale, stripped of all color, and he looked visibly shaken. He began to speak, trying to offer some words of comfort or to explain what they were going to do next, but Hannah simply covered her face and begged him not to say anything. She told him that she had seen it too, and she did not want to hear any of it. The police officers immediately called for backup. Within 30 minutes, the desolate mountain road was flooded with police vehicles, search dogs, and search and rescue teams. They set up a massive perimeter around the area and began a thorough search of the dense jungle bordering the highway. They were searching for the feral woman, hoping to apprehend her before she could hurt anyone else. But despite their massive efforts, the woman was never found. The jungle was too thick, too vast, and too dark. She had vanished into the wilderness without leaving a single trace, as if she had never existed at all. However, the police did find the rest of Hannah's husband's body. His torso was located just a few yards away from where the car had broken down, tucked slightly into the heavy brush at the very edge of the jungle line. It was clear that he had been attacked almost immediately after walking away from the car. The attacker had decapitated him right there on the shoulder of the road and then carried his head back to the roof of the car to consume it while Hannah sat inside, completely unaware of the horrific tragedy occurring just inches away from her. In the days and weeks following the incident, the story spread rapidly throughout Malaysia and eventually the rest of the world. Because of the bizarre, almost unbelievable nature of the crime, many people initially dismissed it as a terrifying urban legend. It sounded like a campfire story designed to scare travelers from driving on the dark mountain roads at night, but the case was very real. There was a full police investigation, a coroner's report, and a devastated widow who had to live with the unimaginable trauma of that night for the rest of her life. And there was one other highly controversial piece of evidence that emerged from the case. During the initial chaos, when the first police cruiser arrived on the scene, one of the officers allegedly took a photograph of the vehicle before they ordered Hannah to step out. This photograph supposedly captured the blurry, terrifying image of a hunched, wild figure sitting on the roof of the car in the dark, holding something in her hands. While the official police department never formally released the photo to the public, copies of it reportedly leaked into the public domain over the years. This photograph became the primary reason that the mystery of the Genting Highlands cannibal has remained active in the true crime community for decades. It serves as a chilling, physical reminder that some of the most terrifying monsters do not belong in storybooks. They are very real, and they are waiting in the dark corners of the world. The identity of the feral woman was never determined. Some speculated that she was a mentally ill person who had wandered into the jungle and lived as a wild animal for years. Others believed she was part of some undiscovered, primitive tribe living deep in the unexplored regions of the Malaysian rainforest. But without a suspect or an arrest, the case remains one of the most bizarre, unsolved mysteries in the history of the country. For Hannah, the nightmare never truly ended. She was left to grieve the loss of her husband under the most horrific circumstances imaginable, knowing that her own survival was a matter of mere seconds and a closed car door. She never returned to the Genting Highlands, and she never spoke publicly about the incident again, choosing instead to disappear into a quiet life, haunted by the memory of the slow, rhythmic thumping on the metal roof of her car. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.